back. During this session, I'm going to talk to you, as Andreas mentioned, about some of the business benefits of APIs and the security challenges associated with receiving those benefits. And I'm going to talk to you about how those benefits are actually driving the requirements. Those challenges are dictating what it is that we need to be building. And I'm going to talk about the architecture and the technology that we can use to satisfy those requirements. I'm going to talk about how those technologies can be used to meet the requirements that are being imposed upon us by the business, and how the security actually becomes a real enabler in all of this. So a few weeks ago, Mark Boyd wrote on the Nordic APIs blog about 6 benefits of private APIs. You can read the blog post here if you follow this URL. And I think he would agree that these particular benefits are available to you if you're implementing partner APIs or APIs that are available to the general public. And what I want to also point out to you is that these benefits are only possible if certain security is implemented. So that's what I'm going to kind of delve into in this talk. And I won't have time to get to all of them, but I am going to touch on the fact that you need to start with your API strategy. I'm going to talk to you about managing the supply chain, and I'm going to talk to you about modernizing your organization. But check that blog post for the rest of those benefits, and hopefully at some point I'll get to the Nordic APIs blog and write about the security implications for receiving those other benefits. But just to start out, let's look at the starting an API. Like, to get any benefits, you have to at least begin. And none of us are beginning with a clean slate. We talked about this during the break. We all have existing legacy systems that are working, that are providing value to the business. But now we find ourselves in a much more mobile, social, and cloudy world. We're using it in our lives today on our tablets and on our phones, and it's awesome, the connectedness that it gives us, the sort of boost that it gives us in our personal lives. And we go to work and we want that same sort of experience, that same sort of benefit. And the business is really pushing toward this. But the fact is, we have existing investments that are made that we can't get rid of. We need to capitalize on these fully. So we need to reuse what we have, and we need to find some way of bridging that old world with the new world, where we don't end up having to start afresh. So this is actually driving some of the new or neo security requirements that we have around actually opening up our data and our systems to this more cloudy mobile world. And in this, one of those requirements is identifying who somebody is on the outside world and converting that into the inside world. So we have some representation of who somebody is in an iPhone. How do we convert that to how those users are represented in those existing legacy systems? This is a requirement of any API platform that we have. We also need to map that content or the format of the information from the new world to the old world. We need to make sure that those legacy systems are abstracted and concealed, that they are not leaked out. We need to make sure that what we are exposing is what we want to be exposing to this new world that we find ourselves in. The delivery of these services needs to work in all modes, and by this I mean it needs to work with public cloud, hybrid cloud, private cloud. It needs to work in a managed service sort of delivery mode. It needs to work on premise. All these are requirements in order for the business to receive these benefits. We also need to make sure all the channels are secure. Definitely want to be thinking about tablets and phones, but we also have to remember that much of our user base is on the PC, at least for now, so it needs to work across all of these different channels. Another benefit that Mark talked about on that blog post was the modernization of the organization. So as organizations begin to adopt cloud and social and integrate more and more with partners, what's happening is a distillation or a sort of paring down of the business's core capabilities into modules and functions that are reusable, and kind of stripping away the unnecessary and just having these reusable components. And these can be composed together almost like Legos. They can be constructed together into different things that weren't originally envisioned. But what happens if your partner doesn't have Legos, but instead has lock blocks, where the pegs and the holes are different sizes. This will be the case if you and your partner have both distilled down your core capabilities, but have disagreeing or incompatible security around those core modules. So in here, security becomes an impediment which we want to avoid. So in order to do that, that's driving some of the requirements around the sort of API platforms we put together to ensure that what we're building can be composed with partners. We want to make sure that it's open, that it's based on international standards. We want to make sure that if we do use any sort of standard, it's a free and open standard which we can implement, that we can examine, that we can consume without having to pay royalties to. And even if we don't decide to implement that ourselves and instead use a commercial off-the-shelf product, we want to make sure that those products perform a very small niche focus in the architecture so that as our world continues to change and evolve, we can pull one of those products out and put in another one that implements those standards without disrupting much of the business or the architecture. This is necessary to receive that benefit of modernizing your organization, not just today, but modernizing it continuously. We also need to ensure that all of the applications that we're building do not handle authentication and authorization. That sort of logic needs to be stripped out of the APIs, the websites, the portals, the desktop applications. No matter what sort of software we're writing, it needs to not answer the question, who are you, what are you allowed to do? Instead, it needs to use that answer of that from other systems, which I'll talk about later on in my speech. So as we kind of change and modernize the organization and distill it down into these core modules, and our partners start to do the same, hopefully, you know, they have Legos and we have Legos, and we can put them together. What we have the opportunity to do is actually optimize our entire supply chain. We have the possibility to take the composable Lego blocks and put them together not only within our own organization or with our strategic partners, but others that we have a more distant relationship with, like Andreas was talking about. You know, get the most bang for your buck from those key partnerships, but this could go really big, right? So this could expand over the entire supply chain. So as we do that, we're talking about a really complicated situation here, but it's necessary if we're going to automate across all of that. So this is driving some of the security requirements, and it's actually a showstopper if we have the wrong security architecture, if we don't have a robust security architecture. The users are going to demand seamless access as they move around in this different ecosystem. They're not going to notice or care that they're going from one security boundary to another. They're just going to notice, why am I being prompted for another username and password? Why am I receiving all this friction? It's so easy at home on my iPad. Why is it so complicated here? We're also going to have these workflows and these orchestrations around these different components. And in those workflows and in those processes, we're going to need to know who somebody is, not only the calling client, but the end user, who could be very distant from the actual API or function that's providing that operation. So how does that information about not only the caller but the end user transfer along in this workflow? These are really complicated things that we need to be addressing and are driving the requirements of our API platforms with regard to security. In order to satisfy this and make sure that the business receives this value, we need to make sure that our API platform has access control, that we have some way of doing account provisioning, that we can create accounts through an automated fashion, not by attaching Excel spreadsheets to emails anymore. That just doesn't scale in the API economy. We also need to make sure and have web single sign-on, federation, and delegated access. And I'm going to get into what these are and why these are important. Let me first of all start with OAuth there, that last one around delegated access. OAuth 2 is a protocol of protocols. It's a new standard that we can use to implement parts of the API security that are necessary to solve these requirements and meet these requirements and deliver this value. It's used as the basis for other protocols like OpenID Connect, which I'm going to get into. And it's really important for addressing some of these key use cases around delegated access, about not giving out passwords to all of these different applications that want to do things on our behalf, but instead using token-based authentication, making it easier to revoke access for a particular client who we've authorized to do things for us. So OAuth is really important, and I want to zoom into that a little bit more. In OAuth, there are 4 primary actors. The first being the resource owner, or the user, who's actually the one creating or controlling the data. And there's also the client who wants to do something with that data on behalf of that end user. Then thirdly, we have the authorization server. And this is the entity or the actor that is in charge of issuing tokens according to the OAuth specification. And then finally, we have the resource server, or the API, which is actually the one that's providing that core capability of the business that we talked about. It's the one that has to determine who the user is and what they should be allowed to do. What data are they accessing? What would they like to do with it? And to answer that question, one of the tools or the capabilities that OAuth provides us with is something called scopes. Scopes are kind of like permissions or entitlements, or some way that we can tell, that we can use to inform the end user, this is what some sort of client, some sort of website, some sort of mobile application would like to do on your behalf. Is it okay that they look at your contacts? Is it okay that they send SMSs for you? These can all be represented by scopes. There's no standard scope per se. We have the freedom to define what it is that our applications need. So this is really useful in designing the authorization policies that we want to have in our authorization server. I want to talk about what OAuth isn't now. OAuth is not an authentication protocol. We cannot use this standard, unfortunately or fortunately, to answer the question, who are you? There's nothing in the specification for identifying and verifying who somebody is. OAuth also isn't a federation protocol. So if we answer that question of who you are in your organization and want to reuse the answer to that question in some other organization, we would want to use federation, and OAuth does not help us with that. It's also not an authorization protocol. And now let me unpack these terms a little bit and kind of the nuances among them. Think about a scenario where you're a business owner and you have some sort of assistant who helps you with parts of that of your running your business, like managing your finances or paying invoices or those sorts of things. Managing invoices, paying bills, these are scopes. These are things that you are entitling them to do, and you are actually delegating to that assistant what they should be allowed to do. But then imagine that assistant goes down to the bank and tries to take money out of the business account. There, the teller would be like the resource server or the API. And that resource server would have to decide, that banker would decide, should you be able to take money out of the business account? Well, perhaps you haven't signed the right forms, you haven't signed the right documents. There, the teller or the API makes an authorization decision. Is this allowed or not? So the API is free to decide, not actually allowed. Haven't signed the right forms. Access denied. So this is the sort of difference that I'm talking about. We can use OAuth to do delegation, but we can't use it to do authorization. So this is a really useful protocol in solving some of those requirements that we have, but the world that we live in is more than that. We need to not only delegate access, we need to do other things. I mentioned federation and single sign-on, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Imagine you have some sort of mobile application that has an API, and you want to be able to authenticate in that mobile application, not with users and passwords that you provide with the mobile consumer, but maybe your partner or that third party wants to manage those identities, or maybe you want to use social identities to log in to your website. Those sorts of things are done for you, only possible for you in your OAuth server if you support federation. Suppose also that within your mobile application or your website using OAuth, you want to know who is that end user who's been delegated access to do something. OAuth can't help us with these things. We don't know anything in the client about who the end user is. We can't support federation. For that, we use OpenID Connect. OpenID Connect is a new standard that is built on top of OAuth to provide federation, to provide identity data on top of OAuth. And though this is sort of the third version of OpenID Connect, it's unrelated to the previous versions except in name. It's not backward compatible. It's designed to be more mobile friendly. It's designed with feature phones in mind, and it's designed to add in additional security properties that put it on the same level as other federation protocols like WS Federation or SAML or some of these others that you might have heard of. So OpenID Connect is really this sort of federation protocol for the next generation. And people are implementing it today and have been implementing it for years, in fact, even though it's been ratified not all that long ago. I want to talk to you now about an example of how we can use OAuth and OpenID Connect to solve a very common case where we want to have some sort of application or client here on the front end calling different APIs or systems on the back end, where each needs to expose data of differing worth, expose information that is more or less important to the organization. So in this case, what happens is a client would redirect to the authorization server, which is also in this case an OpenID Connect server, and there the user would authenticate by some means. What comes back to the client is a one-time usage code or a little token, and that code is redeemed or sent to the OpenID Connect provider, and the response from that is an access token and an ID token. That ID token is that additional layer that's put on top of OAuth that I mentioned, where we can then peer into that from the client and see how did they authenticate, when did they authenticate, how secure was their credential, what's their first name, last name. But it also gets with it an access token, and that access token can be used to call what is defined in the OpenID Connect spec as the user info endpoint. So this user info endpoint is a standard API that the client can use to receive more information about that end user. And one of the things it can receive is certainly email address or those sorts of biographical details, but what it can also receive is a collection of tokens. And those tokens can be used by that relying party to call different web services, different APIs. Why would you want to do this? As I mentioned, these APIs might provide data that's less valuable, more valuable to the business. So the token lifetime, the scopes or the entitlements around what should be able to be done with those tokens can vary based on what API is being called. This is something we see repeatedly amongst our customers. OAuth and OpenID Connect are important protocols for implementing these sorts of requirements that I talked about, but that's not enough. We need other technologies as well, and the ones that we want to turn to are JSON, the JSON Identity Suite, which is a way of encoding identity data as JSON objects, and SCIM, or System for Cross-Domain Identity Management, which is a protocol for automating account creation and group management. We also need a way to entitle or authorize access, whether it's in our APIs or our websites, and we want to do that in a standards-based way using a protocol called XACML. You put all of these together and we have what I call the neo-security stack. This is what we need to build our API platforms on to make sure that they are secure, that they are robust, and that they are protecting the data to the appropriate level. In the system, we have the API management system, we have the identity management system, and the entitlement management system. And unfortunately, I don't have time to go into the different components of these, but the OAuth server, the federation server, they're part of the identity management system. We have a security gateway and an integration layer that's in our API management system, and a way of authorizing those policies in our entitlement management system. If we put our APIs together in this sort of way, with this sort of basis, however we compose our systems, we start to get those benefits because security doesn't become an impediment, but an enabler. So by building on a secure base, a trustworthy base, and putting up those pillars, we can begin to do the business that we're all seeking to do without throwing away what we had and using and begin using what it is that we all would like to have. So with that, I think I'm out of time or nearly out of time. So if there are any questions, I can take them at this point. Okay, great. Well, grab me during the next break maybe and we can have a little chat. But thank you for your time.